All right. Welcome everybody to this month's installation of the Digital Creativity Speaker Series, open to all University York staff and students. Welcome all of you who joined. My name is Florian. I lead esports research here at the DC Labs, and I'm super excited to introduce Rob Black today. He's really a veteran of the esports industry. He's been there from the beginning. I think he's emerged from competitive Call of Duty back in the days in its original installment. We're really excited. Yeah, obviously our collaboration with Rob goes back to 2016. We've since then have had many joint projects, and we're excited that Rob will tell us about them. But really, this is without further ado. Over to Rob Black, who will be talking about his really varied career and sort of a little bit on the history, but also the future of esports and what innovation will bring over the next few years. So, Rob, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks everybody for having me. So it's nice to be here, and I think Florian's going to present my my slides for me, and we can go through some bits as I talk along, and we've got a Q&A at the end as well. So any sort of questions you have, you can put them in the chat, and Florian will read them out to me at the end. So sort of you can ask as we go, I think, as well. So
great. So can you see this, Rob?
Yeah, I can see it. So I assume everyone else can
Wonderful.
see it as well. Yeah.
Right.
Good stuff. Right. So yeah, next slide, please. Hello, everybody. As the slides indicate, I'm Rob Black. I'm the CEO and founder of a business called Promod Esports. I've been a gamer all my life. I've got really fond memories of playing video games with my friends like Golden Axe and Cannon Fodder on a friend Tom on his Amiga, and things like Commander Keen and Frogger and all sorts of other things on our home PC. So really strong memories as a young kid growing up with gaming, and particularly the element that I remember is the social part of gaming, and something that I'm very interested in overall is the social aspects of gaming and esports, and the effect that it has on and will have on society. I got seriously involved, as Flo mentioned, I got seriously involved in competitive gaming and esports in 2003, and that's when the original Call of Duty game came out on PC. I competed in that at a professional level. At the time, you couldn't be a professional Call of Duty player, but the competitive scene as it was, I was in one of the top teams in Europe, and played that game a lot. Subsequently, I moved on from the original Call of Duty into Call of Duty 2, and then Call of Duty 4, all of which were on the PC. And started to organize tournaments and also to manage some of the teams that were playing. So spent a good tranche of time sort of going over all over Europe and things with these teams and running tournaments and what have you. And in 2008, I founded a project called Promod for Call of Duty 4, and it became the sort of de facto modification and competitive rule set for the game Call of Duty 4 worldwide. So that's sort of back then. And then more recently, I joined ESL UK, and I worked as their chief operating officer. And in 2019, I left ESL and I set up Promod Esports, obviously going back to what I'd set up in 2008 and using the name for that to found the business. And I've also been part of the Weaver Consortium for the last two and a bit years. And yeah, overall, I love esports. I'm really lucky that something that's been a passion of mine in gaming and esports for most of my life, I've been able to turn that into a career. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm really fascinated by the sort of social impacts of gaming on wider society. and how fundamentally, to me, gaming, particularly competitive gaming, is a social activity with your friends and also with your enemies or the people you compete against. And I think it has a lot of power to bring people together in the same way that traditional sport does. And I really love that about the industry that I work in. Next slide, please.
Like almost my approach to this would be gaming show experiences.
Sorry, Flo, next slide, please. Thanks. I'm going to talk about the company Promod Esports for a little bit. So next slide, please. So fundamentally, Promod Esports is a service agency. We operate with brands and IP owners such as game developers, and primarily we create tournaments and events and also communities for our partners. And that often involves things like having a dedicated website or operating things like their Twitter or creating a run of tournaments or shows, productions, broadcasts around that community and around that project. So, depending on sort of who we're working with, it's either seen as a real marketing drive for a brand who perhaps wants to access the audience that we have and the demographic that we have within esports. Or if it's working with a publisher, it's more about cultivating long-term retention and stickiness within the game to enable continued monetization for their game title through esports. And really, we're one of the only agencies that is really esports specific, that does a lot of white label work. So the main difference between what I was doing when I was at ESL and what Promod Esports do is that we don't really have our own tournaments that are sort of called the Promod Esports tournament, right? So we mainly work white label or on behalf of brands and IP owners, rather than sort of like ESL have IEM Katowice and the ESL 1 series and their national leagues, and that's something that we don't do. Next slide, please, Flo. So I just thought I'd talk through some example projects of some of the things that we have either done recently or over the last sort of year or so. On the left-hand side, we're talking about the UK and Ireland Nationals, which we run on behalf of Ubisoft. It's for Rainbow Six Siege, and is essentially the national championship akin to the Premier League in football, but for Rainbow Six Siege. And so we have teams competing in that in a season. We sort of have qualifiers, so it's an open format so that you can qualify into it, but you also get relegated at the end of the season, and so then we have more qualifiers. And we deal with everything for Ubisoft on this project. So that goes from as I mentioned, running the qualifiers, which don't have any kind of broadcast, doing our actual tournament throughout sort of 6 to 8 weeks, where we do, at the moment, we're doing online shows because of COVID. So everybody is at home working remotely. And I'll come on to a little bit more about our workflows in a little bit, but we have our on-screen talent, our players, and also all of our staff all sat at home, remoting into the shows. And then usually we would have a finals at a event location where people are able to come and watch and be in a physical audience. Obviously, because of COVID, the last 2 seasons we've not been able to do that. But hopefully, moving forward, probably next year, we'll be able to do that again. And so for us, really, the UKIN project is traditionally very much what we as a company and the people that work in the company are very used to doing. It's very esports focused. We're creating the entertainment around the tournament and the gameplay, and giving people a level of aspiration of like, okay, well, these are the best players in the UK, and I'm seeing them going off from being in this UK league up into the international tournaments and sometimes winning them. I would like to be like that, and so I want to watch and sort of get tips on how they do it, and also it's an entertainment format as well. And then on the right, we've got a few bits of work that we've been doing recently on behalf of Twitch. This one in particular was with Twix, and it really was like a game show format where we had a couple of influencers who were pit against each other in various different sort of in-game challenges, really. And so it was Twix left versus Twix right, which was sort of part of a wider Twix marketing campaign. And also advertisement that you may have seen on linear TV. It was a really simple show for us from a technical point of view, but it was basically a 2-hour broadcast with these mini challenges, and one of the influencers won at the end of the project. And so that's kind of a way that we're using or being part of helping brands to integrate into gaming and access the gaming demographic through entertainment. Next slide, please, Flo. And another good example on the left of entertainment format is actually another project that we did with Twitch for World of Warcraft's Shadowlands launch. It was basically aimed at people who've not played World of Warcraft before, and so there were some influencers who never played World of Warcraft before, partnered up with some very experienced WoW players, WoW competitive players and streamers. And the format for the sort of 2 hours was show how easy and accessible it is to pick up and play something like World of Warcraft Shadowlands, and that it's good fun and something that's a social activity and that you can sort of jump into. So very sort of marketing focused, clear call to action for Blizzard and for us as the client of Blizzard to be able to drive people to pick up World of Warcraft Shadowlands. And on the right, we've got Creative Assembly, who make a range of games called Total War. They are a bit like, well, they are tabletop simulator games. So you have a big army and you place them down, and then the sort of you're the general and you can move your army around and they sort of fight against each other. But they've also got the license with Games Workshop to work with the Warhammer series, and so this game, Total War Warhammer 2, has a community that quite enjoy playing competitively against each other, and we worked with Creative Assembly on creating a weekend of tournaments called the Everchosen, where we invited some of the top players to compete against each other. At this point, I'll delve a little bit into sort of our workflow, because it is quite interesting. So for this one in particular, sorry, go back, Flo. Still on this one. It's still Total War Warhammer on the right that I'm talking about here. No, that's fine. No problem. So with Warhammer 2, very similar workflow to the other things that we've been doing during COVID, in that everybody was working remotely. We had an added complication that the on-screen talent, so the two people that you can actually see in that screenshot on the right-hand side there, they were both based in North America. And so we were taking feeds from those two people. They were also the people that were spectating the game, so in game. The players were in various different locations, including the west coast of the US, in Europe. One was in the Middle East. So we had feeds coming from lots of different locations. It was all being put through actually our server that's located in the Roncook hub, and then it was being pushed to an AWS, where we were splitting that feed to go to the destination, which was Twitch in this instance, but we are able to split that destination to other locations as well, and not just to one destination. So a fully remote cloud, cloud integrated broadcast workflow with this one. Actually, the Warcraft project on the left also, the Warcraft one on the left had no physical based hardware at all. On our side, it was all cloud operated using vMix, and a couple of instances on AWS. So so we kind of, since lockdown has happened, we've had to sort of pivot from the way that we would traditionally do a lot of broadcasting, where we've got all of our people on site. So that would, for an average smaller esports broadcast, so like national level competition like UK and I talked about on the last slide, you're talking about sort of 5 people from a staffing point of view, plus the on-screen talent, so that might be 3 or 4 or 5 people. So they would all normally be in a studio and a gallery, with the teams playing remotely, unless it's a finals, in which case you would get the players also on site, and you also might beef up some of the elements of staff because of needing to do things on stage, etc. But yes, since COVID's happened, we've adapted everything to be fully either fully remote or certainly all online, and not necessarily full cloud-based workflow. But it's been really interesting to find some interest to find some really innovative tech solutions. One in particular called Parsec, which originally was set up by the founder Benji as a way to play games with each other on a super low latency connection. We've been using it actually to have a controller sit at home on, to be honest, a really average like laptop, and be able to control our very high powered servers or encoders sat in the wrong cook hub at the moment, to process the broadcast. It's been really interesting working with them on that. And actually, we know that we were the first company in esports to use them, and they've been pretty widely adopted across the esports industry now, which is really cool. Next slide, please, Flo. I just wanted to share a couple of screenshots of the ESL Premiership, which is the ESL National League for the UK, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we do from a graphics point of view, and some of the data that we're highlighting of the games when we're live. So that image in the top right hand corner is not quite the normal HUD that you get when you're watching Rainbow Six Siege. So we've got like a little bit of data manipulation there. In the bottom left, some examples of using data from the season to create matchups against the 2 different teams, and top left, you've just got the talent during a broadcast, and bottom right is the bracket. So it's pretty simple. Next slide, please, Flo. This one gives you just a bit of an idea of the viewership really for a national league. Rainbow Six Siege is what we would class as a tier 2 esport. It's not quite on the same level as something like Counter-Strike or League of Legends, or even Overwatch, but over the last sort of 4.5-5 years, it's had steady growth. Ubisoft have been particularly good at cultivating their community and providing really good updates of content to their game, and their player base has grown steadily, and their retention within the game has been very strong, and that's been really harnessed and has been integral to that. Has been their esports strategy, including their national leagues and their pro leagues, and then their world sort of championships competitions. But this gives you an idea of the kind of numbers. We're sort of talking for an average day of competition that we're broadcasting. It's sort of 5,000-ish people watching, unique people at the same time watching. So it's not a huge amount of unique people at the same time, but across social impressions and across the total hours watched, Ubisoft are very happy with that kind of level of engagement. I think it probably represents a significant portion of what they see as their monthly average users for Rainbow Six Siege in the UK, and that's what they're sort of benchmarking against. Next slide, please, Flo. And with this one, I just wanted to give a picture of something that we did on behalf of UEFA and ESL last year, which was to operate the group draw for the Euro 2020 tournament, which was a Pro Evolution Soccer competition last year, and just because this is a really traditional TV-esque studio setup, and something that I think, in a minute I'm going to talk about a bit of the history of esports and sort of where we've come from to where we've got to and probably where we're going. This really sort of highlights essentially an inflection point of where, over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, esports has caught up to traditional TV in terms of particularly its look and the way that, and its approach, so that we, as you can see from this photo, it looks like it's just a normal television studio, right? And how that actually now esports is moving on, probably as quickly, or if not quicker, than traditional TV in the way that it's iterating upon the innovation. Next slide, please, Flo. Right, so I'm going to give everyone a bit of a TLDR on the history of esports, which is a too long didn't read. So for those of you that haven't been involved in the industry for 18 years that I have now, just give you a little, and actually this goes back beyond I was involved as well, just to give you a little bit of context on the state of play and sort of where we're at within esports and why we're in that position. Next slide, please, Flo. So this image, some of you might have seen it before, is actually the National Space Invaders Championship that Atari held in 1980. And so I'm using this because it kind of gives an example. It's the first photo that I can find, or that anybody's been able to find, of the sort of first real esports tournament. There was another tournament in 1962 for Space War that was, but I kind of, it was sort of just a group of friends, and it wasn't really like an open tournament. And so I sort of class this as the first esports tournament that ever happened. And actually Atari had over 10,000 people participate in this competition. And I think you can see from this image, like, essentially it was a high score tournament. So, people weren't competing against each other within the game, but they were competing for a high score. And there's a lot of similarities to esports in its current fashion and as a participation and spectator sport with this image. So you've got the participants there all in front of the lovely old TVs. You've actually got somebody in the middle there with a microphone. So there is somebody sort of commentating in a way, and behind, I suspect it's families, but you've got an audience of some description, right? And then we've also seen, traditionally over the years, other tournaments such as the Nintendo World Championships, that was in 1990, and things like Battle by the Bay, which was first in 1996, which was a fighting games tournament. Actually, you might have heard of it now because it's now called Evo, and was recently bought by Sony Entertainment. I think that was like 2 months ago. But really, esports, it's very much in the zeitgeist at the moment, and is pushing through into mainstream culture. But it's been around for a long time, and I think I'll sort of explain over in the next slide or two why we're seeing it much more within mainstream. But next slide, please, Flo. Here's some more examples, or certainly more recent examples, particularly from when I've been involved in esports, of esports over the last sort of 20 years. So in the top left, you've got those 3 images are of CPL, which is the Cyber Athlete Professional League. It was founded in 1997 by a guy called Angel Munoz, an American chap, and obviously you can tell from the branding, sort of very American. Well, you probably can't quite see it, but it's actually a guy at a keyboard with his arm up, and it sort of looks like the NFL or the NBA logo. And they were running events until about 2008. Actually, a lot of esports activities that were running prior to 2008 stopped because of the recession in 2008, including CPL. But really, they were forerunner for a lot of the way that we see modern, large, traditional, or modern large esports competitions. They had a world tour, they had players from lots of different teams, including some of the teams that are around still now, competing and traveling all over the world. I think in 2005, they had a $1 million competition for Painkiller. So we're not talking about sort of insignificant numbers or even people participating. One of the main barriers back then was being able to watch, and you can see that image of the three in the right hand side. That's actually a screenshot of Counter-Strike 1.6, and being able to watch Counter-Strike 1.6 back then through CPL was quite difficult. Most people couldn't watch it, and in fact most of the games weren't streamed live. You had to watch them as a demo file afterwards. In the top right, you can see another competition very similar to CPL called the ESWC, or Electronic Sports World Cup. Those pictures are actually taken in 2008 in Paris. I was there with a Call of Duty 4 team that I was managing. You can see the stage up there actually is very similar to a lot of the modern esports stages. There's a lot of effort going into the productions even back then. And I remember that the audience size or potential audience size was about 5,000 people. It certainly wasn't full, and that's one of the other big things that's changed in sort of the last 12, 13 years, is the amount of people physically going to esports tournaments. In the bottom left, you've got the Clash Royale World Finals that was held in 2017. At the Copper Box in London's Olympic Park. We actually did this as part of ESL UK. We had 9 simultaneous language streams happening at the same time for this event. So it's quite a complicated production workflow. So broadcasting simultaneously to, I think it was 18 different locations across Twitch and YouTube. Interestingly, the reason that I've included this one specifically is because the colored floor that you can see was actually projection mapping from the live in-game Clash Royale competition. So it was a very, very cool broadcast and competition and project to be involved with, really sort of pushing the boundaries of entertainment and immersive entertainment with esports, particularly for the live audience in the Copper Box. It was a really, really, really cool experience to have. And then in the bottom right, just wanted to put in an example of the International, which is now one of the biggest competitions in the world, certainly in terms of prize money. It didn't happen last year because of COVID, but the year before it was like $34 million prize pool. And this is actually a picture of the first one that happened in 2011 when Dota 2 was actually still in beta and not fully accessible. But a lot of esports events around 2010 were held at wider games industry events like Gamescom and E3. And it's just a picture to give that example that, esports has moved on because of the increase in people, and I'll come on to why the people have increased, because it's moved on a lot, and so now we're able to have these competitions like the Clash Royale World Finals that are separate from the traditional games industry events like E3 and Gamescom. Next slide, please, Flo. So I wanted to include a few pictures of IEM Katowice. So this is regarded as sort of one of the pinnacle esports events outside of the League of Legends World Championship and the Dota 2's the International. It's organized by ESL. It's in Katowice in Poland every year. Well, except for the last 2 years, because of COVID, it's been significantly changed. I'll come on to the one more recent one in a minute because it's quite interesting as to how they've adapted, how ESL have adapted. But traditionally, it's held at the Spodek Arena, which is actually a Soviet era arena originally for ice hockey. And during the IEM Katowice, it can hold up to about 17,000 people at any one time. It's got an amazing atmosphere, broadcast live on Twitch. It's like really, really awesome to go and experience esports when it's so big. But the way that the way that ESL have adapted more recently to creating broadcasts that are done from a remote studio, done from a green screen virtual studio in their studios in Poland, while having all of the players at home, but still creating a very similar vibe to the in-person event has been a really interesting thing to watch. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about sort of the drivers as to why the industry's changed so much in terms of viewership and being able to push into the mainstream, but ostensibly like not really changed that much in terms of like the images and sort of the way this kind of competition works in the last 15 years. And there's a few technological reasons as to why that is. Predominantly, it's actually been bandwidth. So, you go back sort of 15 years ago, and I remember watching the first live stream I ever watched of esports was a CPL event, and it was the World Tour for Painkiller, and I could only watch it in 240p. And I subsequently ended up speaking to the people that ran that broadcast in about 2006, and they had about 15,000 people watching from all over the world when it was live. But CPL had to pay for that bandwidth. For every person that connected, they had to pay for that connection and for the bandwidth that they were taking. And it ended up costing them over $45,000 just for the stream bandwidth that they were doing for that event. And obviously, back then that was quite a prohibitive thing for tournament organizers to be able to provide that service. And so the majority of esports content, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't done live. It was done through demo files where in the game you would record what was happening, and then you would like put it on a community website or hub, and then people would download that and then watch it within their game client. Or there would be things like a score ticker or an API that pulls straight from the game and would put the information into what was called MIRC, which was basically Discord of its day. And the other big thing that sort of happened was that there was a plugin for Winamp, which was basically like a radio tool. Or like Spotify, that was called Shoutcaster, and that basically meant that with this plugin you could broadcast out to the internet just your voice, anything you wanted really. So a lot of the older tournaments used to use Shoutcaster and the Winamp plugin to be able to talk about what was happening. So the shoutcaster would go into the game and view the game and tell everybody what was going on. And it's one of the reasons why now that the commentators that we have in esports are often called casters or shoutcasters. So other than the sort of that element around bandwidth becoming a lot more available for everybody, the growth of home consumer and sort of prosumer broadcast technology has been a really big driver. Traditionally, broadcasting has been really expensive, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware. A big TV studio is a multi-million pound investment for anybody creating one, and so being able to get the content out there, using things like webcams, and the fact that companies like Blackmagic are creating hardware that's a fraction of the cost of traditional broadcast. The esports as an industry has been really able to create content on a shoestring, and lean into our sort of tech background of sort of hacking things together, as it were, so that in 2007 I could go to a random internet cafe in the Netherlands and we could have a COD 4 tournament with 36 teams and we could broadcast that to people across Europe. And it didn't really cost much more than a couple of £1,000, which would have been unthinkable at the time to a traditional broadcaster. Everybody sort of talks about the Twitch effect. The Twitch effect has been huge. The ability to have a hub for our live content, the more accessible, cheap to produce live content. It's been great for the wider esports ecosystem. The fact that Amazon bought Twitch as well has been a really huge driver for the rest of the industry. Discoverability and cross-pollination of the audiences between casual gamers and esports communities, fueling that growth has been an incredibly important aspect for the increase in numbers. And then also I would say that the lack of paywalls that esports have has traditionally been really important for growth. You look at the state of modern sports at the moment with things like Sky Sports and pay-per-view fights. Esports is free, or certainly has been free for a long time, and that monetization of the audience is done through advertising and sponsorships. Really, one of the issues that esports has now is that that monetization is quite a long way behind traditional sports, even if you take away the media rights element that traditional sports has. We're not getting as much money per fan into esports as we are with traditional sports. And it's one of the reasons that we actually set up the Weaver project, was to explore avenues of engagement and monetization of the audiences. Next slide, please, Flo. So this is the barest slide of them all, actually, but what does the future look like? And I just wanted to sort of talk about moving forward and research and development. Sorry, next slide, Flo. Next slide, Flo. Research and development is really important in us moving forward as an industry. We're already seeing some really interesting ways to engage audiences further. We've got some basic sort of voting mechanics that are happening within Twitch broadcasts and things. But one of the things that we've been doing that's very, very cool is the Weaver project. And I'm just going to not talk for a little bit here to give you a view of what we've been doing with the virtual studio.
Thailand, America's grand final. Two teams, Quincy Crew versus Thunder Predator, battling it out in this best of 5 to find out who's going to be the victor. And it was, of course, Quincy Crew taking the victory in this game 1. And to help me really get into it, to help me dive deep into stats, it is, of course, going to be a man we know by many, many names, but today we will be calling him Gareth as he gets over in the analyst desk to help us get deeper into this one. But, the main factor out of any Quincy Crew victory is always going to be partly down to this man, Yawar. And he had another outstanding performance today, but I think the first thing we want to look at here is, of course, that performance index. Now, this is a number generated by Weaver based on 13 different metrics to come up with this parameter, and this is versus the 50% average of a normal hero. So 31% above that at 81%, a very good performance from him in the end. But it wasn't always that way, actually. Earlier on in the game, he did kind of struggle to come into it, as we can see here on this overtime graph, and have a look at that performance index. He struggled at the start. Meanwhile, the Troll Warlord was way above him at the start of the game. And what we really want to look at is this crossing of...
I'll just talk a little bit more. So basically, this is taken from Doc 10, who are one of the Weaver partners, consortium partners, utilizing the data in the back end framework that's been developed by University of York. And on the right, you can see the 360 in the Roncook hub currently being turned into a virtual studio. We've actually moved about 200K's worth of equipment up into getting things started for the R&D studio. But this kind of more immersive, very much sandbox ability that a virtual studio provides is really, I think, super exciting. I mentioned earlier that the ESL have sort of adapted what they've been doing because IEM hasn't been happening. They've also been using a virtual studio, although they've been using it in a very traditional TV kind of way. It just kind of looks like a normal studio. the amazing thing about having a virtual studio is that you can do what we're sort of doing here with this video with Weaver, is that we're able to integrate so many more data points and things, and we can create whatever we want in that space. And so having or sort of blending what was passive consumption of a linear broadcast that was, you know, one for all, we're able to create something that you're able to participate in, that has applied game mechanics, that has a layer of data over a game or a traditional sport, or even just normal entertainment, and put it into a space that you know, further down the line you can also go into in virtual reality or in augmented reality. And I like that blurring of the line, I think is incredibly interesting. And I think really what excites me, particularly from an esports industry perspective, about the virtual studio R&D studio with York, is that no idea is silly. Like we can really look at whatever we want to, and just have ideas from left field and see how that they can be teased out and apply to the future of broadcast and technology. And I think that's just super exciting. And that's it, I think, from me. Q&A.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. And I shall stop sharing so I can properly see the chat. And this was really insightful, Rob. Let me just quickly go into the chat. If there are any questions, please do type them now. I can't see any in, but I'd be happy to kick things off. Rob, in terms of the character, so, you know, obviously innovation has always played a really central role in esports, as you've outlined. I'd be curious to hear how you think how the nature or the role of innovation, though, has changed from the early beginnings to what it is now. Right? Could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the innovation that was happening earlier on was how do we solve a really specific problem that wasn't necessarily a need of the wider audience, or it wasn't the sake of it, it wasn't doing something for the sake of it being cool or to just be innovative. It was, we actually have a problem and we need to have an innovative solution to solve that problem, because currently there isn't anything that the market can provide us. So yeah, I think particularly things like, you know, being able to at scale give a video of what's happening live within a tournament was a problem. Yeah, that's one of the ways that DJ Wheat at Twitch helped really revolutionize the industry was by giving us the ability to have that content. And I think, you know, innovation now is still solving problems, obviously, and needs of the audiences and needs of sponsors, and also needs of IP owners. But it certainly feels like, particularly in the last 5 years, that we've also been able to innovate just because we can, and because somebody thinks it's a good idea, rather than it being a luxury.
So so it's moved from problem-driven innovation into opportunistic or explorative innovation.
I think so, yeah.
Right.
Particularly in the last 5 years, I would say. Yeah.
Brilliant. That's a really good thought. There's one question now from Isabel. How has lockdown affected esports, and associated with that, virtual production is very exciting. Do you think we are seeing the end of large-scale in-person tournaments? Here we go.
I'll answer the second question first. No, I don't think we're seeing the end of large-scale in-person tournaments. I think that will still continue to be the pinnacle. There is, as a player, there's nothing like competing against somebody on stage. It is different to being at home in a clutch situation where it's one player versus a couple of other people, and you've only got 30 seconds on the clock, and you need to plant the bomb, or you need to do whatever you need to do. That adrenaline rush on a stage versus at home is different. And I think for players in particular, they will want to get back in front of audiences, large scale in-person audiences, as soon as possible, as soon as it's safe anyway. And I think, from a live audience perspective, going to a live esports tournament and sitting in a crowd of even 5,000 people versus watching it at home on Twitch, the experience is totally different. It's like going to a music festival or to a gig. It's something very compelling about just being there and being part of something with lots of other people, and it's incredibly entertaining. So I don't think they're going anywhere. Virtual productions are very exciting, and I think what's really interesting about what they allow us as an industry to do is be a bit more creative and actually save some costs in certain areas. And so I actually think that virtual productions are going to be really, really good for the grassroots level of esports. Being able to have more tournaments broadcast that traditionally in the last sort of 5 or 6 years perhaps wouldn't have been broadcast because they sort of just didn't even have any budget to be able to pay for them. Now you can more easily create that content by having just sort of one person run a production virtually and remotely, rather than it needing perhaps a couple of people, or that the technology wasn't quite there. And then the wider question about how lockdown has affected esports, the answer is we don't really know yet, because lockdown will have had a wider effect on the global economy, and we're not really at a position yet for everybody to understand quite what that means for the global economy just yet. As I mentioned in the slides earlier, in 2008, when we had the last financial crash, it was really bad for esports. Probably set the industry back about 5 years. I don't think we're going to necessarily see that kind of level of effect, if at all. But we might see some reduction in certain non-endemic sponsors coming into esports that perhaps would have wanted to pull the trigger, last year. It's hard to say. Yeah.
Great. Now I've got another question. I know that a lot of people here on this panel, among the attendees, they're interested in game design, they're interested in storytelling. You've showed a really rich portfolio of different games that you've covered, and I think what I can take from it is that different games make it easier or harder for you as a content producer to actually create a product around them, right? And specifically from a game design perspective, do you know of any cases where viewing or the spectator aspect of the game is purposefully designed into the game to make it more viewable? Do you feel that esports is there an effect that esports have on the actual game developers to think about their games differently? Do you have any view on that?
Yeah, I think so. It's been an interesting transition to sort of 12 years ago, where that wasn't happening at all. Esports was driven by communities that liked the game and then turned it into an esport because they like competing within it. And that's why we needed things like Promod for Call of Duty 4, because actually the out-of-the-box multiplayer experience wasn't very competitive. It had things in there that meant you had random stuff happening that was a bit unfair, and so we had to change that. But really, with Riot creating League of Legends, and they created League off the back of Dota, which was a mod of Warcraft 3. they were building it as Dota players for it to be a competitive game title. And so, you know, they put in things like a spectator mode. And I think a lot of publishers are looking at Riot's model and, you know, how they're being very successful with League of Legends and the LCS and the LEC here in Europe, and wanting to create games that are specifically made for esports. But as the same with any game that a publisher creates, making something, there's no guarantee that it's going to be successful. You know, there has to be a certain amount of luck. It's not just you have to be a really good studio. Sometimes games just aren't popular for whatever reason. That might be that in the moment the audience aren't receptive to that particular genre or whatever it is. But certainly game publishers are really looking at esports as to how to develop their games specifically for an audience. Sometimes things fall through the cracks. I mean, Blizzard developed Overwatch specifically to be an esport, and they shipped it without a spectator client, so nobody could watch it, which was unbelievable, really, that fell through the cracks. But you know, the most recent game titles that have come out that are, you know, really targeted as esports are things like Valorant, and Riot have a lot of experience with. They created League of Legends, so they've done a really good job of making the whole player experience, the viewer experience, even using it from a tournament organizer and broadcaster point of view. Valorant's just really nice to use, and I think the only thing that perhaps is a little bit more difficult with Riot is getting things like APIs from them to be able to get more in-depth statistics. They're a little bit protective of their IP, which obviously is, but yeah, it's certainly changed a lot, and I can see that you know, as we move forward into a world where game publishers continue to specifically develop games for esports, understand the value of having the long-term stickiness and retention of the player base because of esports, that they will continue to innovate and also integrate more tools and solutions into their player and user experience for people creating content.
Great. Well, so lastly, I think most of our audience are really sort of struck by thought at the moment. So I want to give you one last question, Rob. I know you've been recently engaged to one of the most successful women in the industry, and so I know that, you know, diversity is something that you care about. There is a Q&A from Marion in the panel. Okay. I wanted to quickly talk about. You wanted to talk about diversity, but I would love to prioritize a question in the Q&A panel, but I unfortunately cannot see it. I do apologize. I see Isabel's. And after that there is okay, right. So let's bank the diversity question, and it's really tied to audience growth and sort of going beyond a certain point, which I wanted to ask you. But first one from Marion, what is your hunch with regards to convergence of physical sports and esports? Taking, for example, the trend of football clubs adopting esports teams, do you think physical esports will soon have replicas?
I think it's an interesting question. My personal opinion is that, well, and the fact is there already are quite a few e-replica sports. We saw last week that the IOC have announced that they are going to be doing a virtual Olympics with various simulator games. Simulator game being a simulation of a traditional sport, but in the virtual world. And what does that convergence sort of look like? It's really difficult to say, and I think that what you were mentioning there, Marion, in terms of the trend of football clubs adopting esports teams or having sort of FIFA players or that kind of thing is more brand protectionist than it is a true strategy. There is a lot of talk from traditional sports bigwigs about the lack of engagement from millennials into their sports, particularly with football. That's one of the reasons that the European clubs had set up the ESL, even though it got sort of very quickly shot down by the fans. Sergio Perez has said explicitly that it's because the younger audience isn't engaging, so we want to create something more exciting. I think fundamentally they misunderstand what the problem is. They think that it's because their audience doesn't like football or isn't engaging with football because it's boring. That's not the problem. The problem is their delivery method. Their delivery method is behind a paywall. It's long. It's not on the platforms that the audience want to consume on. And so they are sort of lashing out and trying to find solutions to a problem that actually they need to reframe their point of reference and how they're going to approach it. I appreciate that's a bit of a side quest, but do I think that it's going to be anything of significance? I don't really think it will be. My hunch is that esports will continue to evolve really as a peer to traditional sports, and that we will see, rather than calling esports, we will call it League of Legends, because it's League of Legends versus the NBA. It's not esports versus the NBA. And I think that's the fandoms around the individual esports will become more and more apparent as we move forward. Will there be a blurring of the lines between like sim esports and traditional sports and other esports? I think so. But really, sport in itself is cyclical in popularity. Baseball in the 1920s in America was easily the most popular sport, probably in the world in terms of how many people watched it. And it's not anymore, right? It's like, I think, the fifth most popular sport in the US. And the same can be said in much shorter time frames of esports, but I think the same can be said of all sports globally. And will we see an esport being more popular than soccer one day? Maybe not, because of access to technology, but will we see it being more popular, one particular esport, I mean not just esports in general, one particular esport being more popular than something like basketball or the NFL? I think so. And I think that that's probably not that far away. I would think that the League of Legends would probably overtake something like the NFL within the next 5 years.
Okay, I mean, I guess it makes sense. I mean, there's also the interesting aspect, and Marion, I don't know if you were going into that, but there's also the sort of the new emergence of sports that sort of mix, sort of for instance, the AR sports that mix physical components with digital components. So that's another category that's definitely
really interesting.
Yeah,
like the new. It's a new game, really. It's a new esport technically, and having the ability to be physical with a digital layer, I think is really cool. Like, just from a personal point of view, I would love to be able to like basically play a game of Counter-Strike, but I have to run around the map, that would definitely be a lot of fun. Whether or not it would be super popular, I think is a bit different. I think we're needing to kind of get to the point where it's Ready Player One and a metaverse, where you've got a good level of home immersion into a virtual space before you're able to have that kind of thing.
Okay, well, so I have found the Q&A panel. That's just down to me being a newbie. There are no further questions, but I quickly did want to wrap up with this question, Rob. We've heard Heather in the background a little bit. I know you're sharing a home office.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. And I just wanted to give people some background. It's basically your partner is also very successful in esports, has her own business. I think obviously diversity, not just in regards to women, but minorities and also people who are neuroatypical, who are have certain physical disabilities, but are still included in esports. I mean, it has obviously a cultural and social meaning, but at the end of the day, there's also a commercial argument attached, which at some point esports is going to exhaust the the sort of category of hardcore fan. I know the casuals are pushing in there, but you know, I really would like to just very hear your quick thoughts on sort of how diversity, how you can address it in sort of in the way you produce your products, and how you feel that is sort of commercially relevant for esports moving forward to continue to grow at the pace it's growing at.
Yeah, I think you reference nicely that esports is very accessible. It's not fully accessible, and that I think we have to acknowledge that traditionally computer games and having access to a PC or a console has been something that is prohibited by cost. It's not fully accessible to people globally, and also particularly multiplayer games, you need an internet connection. So there's whole swaths of the globe that are unable to participate or watch or have any kind of involvement. And I think that we have, as stewards of the industry, we have a duty of care to ensure that we are being as accessible as possible, be that through creating specific tournaments that put players from a disadvantaged background or from diverse backgrounds onto a pedestal to show that it's possible. I think anything that we do to highlight diversity within our industry helps with our ability to be to appeal to people. I think it's genuinely, I've seen a few people sort of transformed from esports. One chap I know in particular, and I first met him when he was 14, and he was really struggling with school, and he just couldn't really focus on anything in his life, but he had esports and he had this game that he played, and he then traveled around Europe competing in Call of Duty, and now he's an accountant and he has kids, and it's kind of amazing that gaming has allowed him to do that. Well, not necessarily just allowed him to do that, but it helped him get over a lot of his social anxiety that his disability caused him, or has caused him. And so I think, for us, there is definitely more that we can do in being able to highlight the diversity and the ability, and particularly the social connections that esports create. I think it's a real shame that in mainstream media, there's so much focus of gaming being bad and like this isolationist activity when it's really not. And we need to change the narrative on that, and we only do that by lifting people up. So,
well, perfect, Rob. On that sort of uplifting and deep and meaningful note, I think it's a great conclusion to this really fascinating talk that you gave, Rob. Thank you so much for spending your time and for sharing some of these hard-earned insights with us, I'm sure. And thanks to everyone who has joined. And this will be out on demand, and we look forward to seeing you to the next speakers in the series. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everybody for having me. Cheers.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks. Bye-bye.